Something strange happens when people begin trying to change their lives. At first, they feel motivated. They start thinking differently. They begin imagining new possibilities. For a brief moment, it feels like something inside them has shifted. But then something unexpected appears. Resistance. Not from the world. But from within themselves. Suddenly the motivation fades. Appears. Old habits return. And the version of life they were trying to leave behind slowly begins to pull them back. Most people assume this means they failed. They believe they were not disciplined enough. Not strong enough. Not determined enough. But what if that explanation is incomplete? What if the resistance you feel when trying to change your life is not weakness, but a natural reaction of identity? Because identity is not just a story you tell yourself. It is a pattern your mind has stabilized over time. A pattern your brain has learned to protect. And whenever you try to move outside that pattern, something inside you tries to restore it. Not because you are incapable of change, but because your system prefers what is familiar, even when what is familiar is limiting. The mind is incredibly efficient at maintaining stability. It builds routines. It builds emotional expectations. It builds patterns that make life predictable. Predictability feels safe, even when that safety comes at the cost of growth. And this is why the moment you attempt to become someone new, the old version of you begins trying to survive, not consciously, but through subtle impulses, through hesitation, through distraction. Through thoughts that suggest waiting a little longer, or trying later, or returning to what feels comfortable. Your identity is not just an idea. It is a psychological structure. A structure built from years of repeated thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Structures do not disappear instantly. They resist change. They defend their stability, which means the resistance you feel when evolving is not random. It is simply the echo of who you used to be. Your brain has one primary goal. Stability. Predictability. Survival. And identity plays a major role in maintaining that stability. Over the years, your mind has built a model of who you are, what you deserve. What is possible for you, what kind of life people like you can have. This model becomes your identity. And once identity stabilizes, your mind begins protecting it. It does this through subtle mechanisms, thoughts that create doubt, feelings that generate hesitation. Memories that reinforce past failures. These signals feel natural. They feel logical. But in many cases, they are simply attempts to keep your identity consistent. Imagine someone who has spent years believing they struggle financially. If an opportunity appears that could dramatically improve their life, a strange discomfort may arise. Excitement. Discomfort. Because that opportunity threatens the stability of the identity they have carried for years. The mind often chooses familiarity over expansion, even when expansion would lead to a better life. The mind constantly checks for coherence. It asks silently, is this aligned with who I believe I am? If the answer is yes, the action feels natural. If the answer is no, resistance appears. This resistance can show up in many forms. Procrastination. Self-doubt, fear of judgment, overthinking simple decisions, or the quiet voice that whispers, maybe this is not for you. The protection of identity is subtle, but incredibly powerful. Because once identity is stabilized, the brain begins organizing your perceptions around it. It highlights information that confirms it. And ignores information that contradicts it. Over time, this creates the illusion that the identity you carry is simply reality, when in truth, It is only a pattern that has been repeated long enough to feel permanent. Many people notice something curious when they begin trying to change dot at the exact moment they decide to grow. Life suddenly feels harder, unexpected. Problems appear, old patterns return. Situations arise that test their commitment, and it almost feels like reality itself is pushing back. But what is actually happening is far more subtle. Your perception is still partly anchored in your previous identity, and your habits are still aligned with the old pattern dot. So the moment you attempt to step into a new version of yourself, two identities begin to compete. The old identity seeks stability. The new identity seeks expansion. This internal tension can create confusion. It can create self-doubt, and it can make progress feel slower than expected. But this does not mean change is impossible. In fact, this tension is often a sign that change has already begun, because identity transformation rarely feels comfortable. It feels uncertain. It feels unfamiliar, and sometimes it feels like you are stepping into a version of life you do not fully recognize yet. Your brain is recalibrating. Your perception is reorganizing. Your habits are trying to adapt. And during that transition, moments of friction are inevitable. Growth rarely feels smooth in the beginning, because growth requires leaving the known behind, and the unknown always creates tension. But within that tension, a new identity slowly begins to form. The thoughts you repeat begin to change. The decisions you make begin to change. The standards you accept begin to change. And gradually, the balance between the old and the new identity begins to shift. What once felt unnatural begins to feel possible, and what once felt impossible begins to feel within reach. But this stage is often where many people give up, because the mind misinterprets discomfort as a warning. It assumes difficulty means something is wrong. When in reality, difficulty often means transformation is happening. The moment your identity begins evolving, the familiar world you knew begins reorganizing. Some habits fall away. Some relationships change. Some opportunities appear that did not exist before, and others disappear because they belong to the version of you that no longer fits. Transition can feel disorienting, but it is also the moment when growth becomes real, because transformation is not only about thinking differently. It is about becoming someone whose perception of reality has fundamentally changed. And once that shift begins, there is no simple way to return to the old version of yourself. So how does someone move beyond this invisible resistance? The first step is awareness. When you understand that identity tries to protect itself, you stop interpreting resistance as failure. Instead, you begin recognizing it as part of the process. Every time you choose a new action, you weaken the stability of the old pattern. Every time you think differently, you begin strengthening a new identity. And slowly, through repetition, something remarkable happens. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The uncomfortable becomes normal. And the identity that once felt distant begins to feel natural. At that point, something subtle changes in your perception of reality. Opportunities no longer feel threatening. Growth no longer feels impossible. And the life that once seemed out of reach begins to feel aligned with who you are becoming. Transformation is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It is quiet. Gradual. Almost invisible. But over time, the accumulation of small shifts creates something powerful. A new internal reference point. A new sense of self. A new expectation about what life can be. And once that expectation stabilizes, your decisions begin aligning with it. Your actions begin reinforcing it. And slowly, reality begins reflecting the identity you are becoming. This is why lasting change is rarely about forcing outcomes. It is about reinforcing identity. The more consistently you act from a new self-concept, the more stable that identity becomes. And the more stable it becomes, the less influence the old identity has. Eventually, the internal conflict fades. Hesitation disappears. And the version of you that once felt like a possibility becomes the version of you that feels real. This is the moment when growth stops feeling like effort, because the behaviors that once required discipline now feel natural. And the life that once required constant motivation now feels like a natural extension of who you are. That is the quiet power of identity transformation. It does not only change what you do, it changes what feels normal. And once your definition of normal evolves, the direction of your life evolves with the . So the next time you feel resistance while trying to grow, do not immediately assume something is wrong. Sometimes that resistance is simply the old version of you trying to survive. The real question is this: which version of yourself will you continue reinforcing? The familiar one, or the one that leads you somewhere new?